welcome everyone. Thanks everyone for joining us today for today's speaker series. We're excited to hear from Dr. Ryan Morrison at Colorado State University and Taryn Contento at the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed about their collaborative research under the Transformation Network. This is the first talk in our spring speaker series on community partnerships within the Transformation Network. So we'll hear from Ryan and Taryn today. Next month, we'll hear from Alex Webster and her partners at the Santa Fe Watershed Association. And then in April, we'll hear from Dave Van Horn at UNM and a partner from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So if folks need me to forward those calendar invites your way, everyone should have them now. Please let me know. And looking forward to today's talk and the rest of the talks in this series. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ryan and Taryn. And yeah, thank you both so much for presenting today.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for listening to us talk for an hour. So yeah, this is, you've heard me, many of you who have been part of the TN for a while have heard me talk about CPRW for a long time. And it's been a really great partnership for the past few years. And so what we want to do today is just briefly, I'm just going to kind of talk about a little bit like the history of how we connected over the past few years. And then Taryn's going to talk a bit about what CPRW does kind of from a big picture. And then I'm going to talk about one of my students' work, Brady Jones, and kind of some of the science findings that have come out of the collaboration with me and or CSU and CPRW, because it is definitely bigger than just me here at CSU. So I listed just a bunch of names here, Taryn and myself, and then Hallie, who's the director of CPRW, and then a bunch of my students who have been involved in working with CPRW through the TN. So Brady, Kayla, Elise, and Mariah. Let's see here, make sure I can, oh, here we go. So just a quick history of how the collaboration with CPRW and CSU got started, at least from like my involvement. So you all know, because we've talked about it before, the big 2020 Cameron Peak wildfire that happened here in the Poudre, and that was, it's still the largest Colorado wildfire in history. And that happened right around literally the same time that we were developing the TN proposal. And so after the wildfire, there was a number of funding opportunities that were awarded to us and myself. So I had a career grant be awarded, and then the TN project was funded. And all of this was originally envisioned to already kind of work a little bit with CPRW, but really allowed me to approach Hallie and actually the previous director and say, hey, we have this amazing opportunity to work together after this wildfire, where we knew there was going to be a lot of work put into the watershed to try to respond to, the conditions after the fire. And so in 2021, that effort really kicked off, and that aligned really well. And I think Taryn's going to talk about this with a lot of the work that they started doing in the watershed itself. And so a big part of that is the stream restoration work, which is very much kind of in line with my research. And so CPRW kicked off restoration efforts in 2021. And really that's formed the basis for my students being involved and actually the work that I'm going to talk about that Brady did. And since then, we've been collaborating for 5 years now, and it's actually extended beyond the TN. The TN has been amazing in allowing us to connect, but since then we've gotten additional funding completely separate from the TN to continue our work together on this convergent science, this convergent research, where we're working very closely with CPRW in their restoration to answer scientific questions that can help inform their future restoration efforts, and really just starting some really exciting cutting edge research on restoration in these headwater streams that folks aren't doing elsewhere across the West, but I think will be very valuable. So real quick, I just wanted to throw up at least the group that I've been involved with at CSU. So this is just all the great students and staff and undergraduates that have been supported by this collaboration and by the funding coming through the TN. So all these students, all these people are amazing, and it's been great working with them. So it's been really important to support the work of all of these grad students. So I have more, but I think at this point I'm going to end my um, presentation and pull up Taryn's. And let's see here. Let's see. So what do you guys see? Do you guys still see PowerPoint?
We see the Terrence slides. So
Perfect. Okay. So do you want to?
Um,
Oh, or Taryn, do you want to bring it up?
no, but I will prompt. We'll see how it
Okay.
goes.
Okay. Sounds
This
good.
is a representation of our relationship manifested in a presentation.
There you go.
So yeah, my name is Taryn Contento, and I am the Post-Fire and River Project Manager here at the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. So the short for our long name is CPRW. If you hear me refer to us as that. And I want to give a little bit more information about our organization in general, and then talk about one of the projects that we implemented that we worked really closely with the Morrison Lab on. So go ahead and next. So as Ryan mentioned earlier, there's been a few precipitating events that have led to the formation of our coalition, other coalitions across the Front Range, and a lot of the work that we do. So the first fire that occurred in 2012, the High Park and then the Hewlett Gulch fires, were at the time the second. So the High Park fire at the time was the second largest fire in Colorado history, and really, I think, brought people's attention to the fact that when these large disturbances occur across the landscape, um, that require really collaborative uh, action, that there needs to be an entity that kind of exists at the crossroads to help facilitate all the different entities that need to be involved. And so that was a High Park fire, and then the Cameron Peak fire occurred in 2020, so 209,000 acres. So you'll see now that the High Park fire is the sixth largest wildfire in Colorado history. So we're exponentially getting larger wildfires and burned at really high severity. So you see that little note there that 60% of our forested watershed has burned, which led to the formation of CPRW. So next. So in 2012, we had those High Park and Hewlett Gulch fires. And then immediately following that, in 2013, there was large flooding events that happened across the Front Range, actually more in the Big Thompson, which is south of us, but also impacted Fort Collins. And so really we were already in the point of formation after the Hyde Park fire, and then the floods came through. And I think it really solidified the fact that we know there's going to be these large scale disturbances. We know that following large scale disturbances like wildfires, we're going to have additional impacts for, what we've now realized decades to come, and that we need somebody, an entity that's in the middle that provides the coordination. And that was really supported by the state of Colorado. Colorado Water Conservation Board provided a lot of funding for the formation of different watershed coalitions across the Front Range following these two events. Next. So during our formation, we came up with a mission. So that is to improve and maintain the ecological health of the Poudre River watershed through community collaboration. Um, the Poudre River is a main water source for a lot of different communities in northern Colorado. So it provides water for around 300,000 people. So it's a really valuable asset in terms of drinking water, and also agriculture, and recreation is a big part of how people engage with our watershed. And so I like to emphasize the fact that we also are the community collaboration portion is a really big part of who we are, because it was what facilitated our creation and also what allows us to do more work across the landscape. Next. And so to really drive that home, here's just this is not even an extensive list of people that we work with on a regular basis, but to point out that we're really lucky that we have, I think Fort Collins is a place everyone wants to live. And so we have a lot of entities that can help with the work that we do. Like Rocky Mountain Research Station is a close partner. CSU is a big supporter of our work. CFRI, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and the State Forest Service are entities that can come in with expertise that we just don't have and capacity we don't have to answer questions that help us justify the work that we do and continue to do the work that we do in a way that we think is hopefully the best we can do with the knowledge we have around us, in addition to all the other partners that support funding wise or outreach wise or capacity wise for the work that we do. And I realized that Ryan's in this photo, so it was a
I
good
just
photo.
noticed it. I was like, where is this photo taken? Oh yeah, I remember that day. That was fun.
All right, next. So we do this work in an iterative process. So I mentioned the collaborative portion of how we address projects. In the planning stage is next. So kind of using the information and the goals of different collaborators to arrive at a plan and obviously address different knowledges and scientific backing behind the work we do. We do the implementation, we monitor it, and then we hope to continue that process as we go. And, I'll talk a little bit more about the difficulties in, following this in terms of different partnership goals and different hurdles along the way. But this is the process that we try to use to make sure we're doing the work that we do to the best of our ability. Next. And so to come back to the Hewlett Gulch, High Park, and Cameron Peak fires, what we learned from the High Park fire in 2012 really allowed us to be prepared following the 2020 Cameron Peak fire. So after 2012, like I said, there was a kind of collective recognition that when we address disturbances on the landscape of this scale, that we need a lot of collaborative entities to come together to respond. And we also know that, immediately following a large fire, we're going to have floods. We know that we're going to have sediment. We know that we're going to have increased nutrient loads inside in our rivers. And so following the Cameron Peak fire, we were kind of like ready and anticipating this same response and bringing in partners that we had already started to collaborate with following the 2012 fire and 2013 floods. So next. So what we knew following the High Park fire and anticipated following the Cameron Peak fire is that we would see altered watershed processes, excess nutrients, and sediment in our river. So these are all photos from the Poudre, and debris flow, flash floods, washout of roads, and water quality issues. And so this photo on the far right is actually the Black Hollow debris flow, which happened in 2021 and killed 4 people and destroyed 6 houses. And on the ecological side, impacted fish for up to 50 miles downstream of this event along the Poudre. So huge fish die-offs as a result of the inputs that we saw from this watershed. So what we anticipated, we kind of saw in the landscape. Yeah, next, thanks, Ryan. So we are an organization of 7 people. We recently grew by 2, so we're moving up in the world. But that means that we don't have capacity to address everything that we wish we could. And we also know that when you have a 209,000 acre fire, there's not a lot you can do at scale. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're following planning efforts, and we have planning efforts to guide the actions that we do take to make sure the places that we do put resources and effort are allowing us to have the positive benefit that we hope to see when we implement them. So we do have prioritizations that look at things like where are we anticipating sediment coming from? What was the soil severity in those areas? Where are the debris flow risk? So we can create plans like the next slide. So this is our Upper Poudre Watershed Resiliency Plan, and these are the watersheds ranked on their hazard rank that we use to identify where we should do our work first. And if you know where the Black Hollow watershed is, you'll see that it is bright red. So we were aware almost immediately that watershed was going to be a risk, and had actually talked to those landowners about that risk beforehand. So it's kind of one of those things where it's, we'd never want to see the Black Hollow event, but it is kind of reassuring when we see things that we had planned or identified as areas where we needed action to see that was in fact a true statement. So this is like one of the main guiding documents that provides direction for us in our project identification. Next. We also have something called the Poudre Pearls. So we are super lucky that Dr. Ellen Wool is a CSU professor, and she came up with a framework with other researchers about beads and strings. And so this concept of natural depositional areas versus transport reaches where we wouldn't expect material to kind of deposit naturally. This concept we have been using to identify locations across the landscape as well, specifically related to stream restoration. So Poudre Pearls is how we like to think about it, or how we frame beads and strings, just to relate it back to the Poudre watershed. And the map on the far right is right now where we're at in terms of where we have pearls identified, although the entire upper watershed is in process. And by the end of this year, will be completed in terms of identification of those pearl areas. Next. So now that we know that we have an anticipated path forward in terms of what we anticipate on the landscape, we have planning efforts that identify where we should work as a result of those disturbances on the landscape. The way that we have addressed post-fire concerns and improving watershed health was aerial mulching, point mitigation, point mitigation was an immediately following the Cameron Peak fire and was more about life and property. And so that has transitioned into more just general stream health and resilience. So point mitigation being like, let's address this moment, what we know is at risk. And then over time, we are allowed to take a step back and say, well, like, let's use the information we know about natural depositional areas, not chase these localized rainstorms or areas where we might anticipate sediment being like, let's just catch it in the stream where we know it'll be eventually. And then we have another program that does reforestation. So next. So really quickly, just to show you what that means on the ground, we did about 10,000 acres of aerial mulching. This is a really labor intensive, really expensive method to addressing, basically concerns about sediment inputs and debris flows, et cetera, on the landscape immediately following the fire. So it's hard to address a 200,000+ acre fire. So this is kind of the first action that seemed appropriate at the time. There is research that has come out about how we could have done that better and whether that should have been the way to approach it in the, knock on wood, future fires. So next. And just because I don't think that people know what that looks like, this is what it looks like on the ground. We just chipped a whole bunch of dead trees. So what had burned in the Cameron Peak fire, put it in a helicopter in a giant net, and then dropped it from the sky. And this is what it looks like on the ground afterwards. Next. We also have a reforestation effort in areas that we know, especially from the High Park fire, will not regenerate on their own, especially ponderosa pines. So we planted about 44,000 trees since the Cameron Peak fire on over 500 acres with a 76% survival rate. I believe that's after the first year because we're employing best practices and we use volunteers to plant these trees. We also work with CFRI to identify the bands where we should be planting trees, anticipating climate change. So kind of anticipating a changing climate so that we know, like, not just are they going to survive 1 year, we anticipate that they survive for a long period of time. We collect all of the seeds locally and then we grow them out in local nurseries. So we're trying to follow best practices when it comes to reforestation and the fact that we just don't have a robust seed source anywhere in the United States. So next. So the things that I actually work in. So like I said, we took the point mitigation immediate response following the Cameron Peak fire and expanded that out into stream health and resilience. And so over the last 5 years, I guess, we have implemented 14 different projects, 14 different project sites across our watershed that correspond to the areas that we've identified as high priority in our hazard assessment. And this is where, like, our relationship with CSU, our relationship with different partners has been really valuable because, this is, I guess, not a new practice, stream restoration, especially using process-based restoration, but it is new in this area. And it is new. There's a lot of different novel questions that come from the efficacy of this work. So next.
Do you know how to do a pointer? I was gonna point out. Can you guys see my pointer at all?
Yeah, if you click next, it'll put a box around it.
Oh, I was just gonna point out Upper Elkhorn. Maybe you are. Well, anyways, if you see Upper Elkhorn, that's where I'll be talking about later too, just for everyone. Yeah. Oh, duh. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Upper Elkhorn.
Want me to go next?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just to zoom in on Elkhorn Creek. So Elkhorn Creek is a major tributary into the main stem of the Poudre and an area that we have, as CPRW, put in a lot of extensive work over the last few years. So we actually started working in this watershed in 2015 with wildfire mitigation restoration because we knew that this area was of high priority, which means it was super dense and that if a fire came through here, it would burn pretty devastatingly. So had already done forest thinning, prescribed burns across 1,000 acres of forest in this area. We also mulched the upper headwaters of this watershed after the Cameron Peak fire and currently have about 6 miles of stream restoration planned in 2027. So the Upper Elkhorn project that we implemented in 2022 and that we worked closely with the Morrison Lab to study was the first project that we implemented and the first one that the Arapahoe Roosevelt National and Pawnee National Forest had implemented on their managed land. Next. So what does this look like? This was funded for us by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. It was their first non-point source 319 grant that we just actually wrapped up this year, or I guess 2025. And we have extensive partners. So I mentioned that we collaborate a lot, and this is also an example of that. And I actually wasn't employed by CPRW at the time, but I love this photo at the top right because I'm in the center holding that sledgehammer. So I worked for another organization implementing stream restoration using volunteer labor. And so I was a part of this project prior to even being on staff for CPRW. It was on the Forest Service property. I mentioned it was the first process-based restoration that had been implemented on the ARP, the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest. We use a consultant to help us with design. This was done by volunteer labor as well as a contractor. We found that contractors are basically when you pay someone, there's more chance that they will do what you want on a time frame that you want as you want it done. So it's valuable to have both. I think the volunteers bring a lot of value in connecting with the public, and they have a different expertise. We worked with the Laramie Conservation Corps and obviously CSU and Rocky Mountain Research Station. Next. And then just to really drive home the point that we are an outward-facing entity and that we do a lot of tour and outreach. This is our board out for a site visit. These are volunteers out. I've probably done a dozen or so site tours here. And then if you click next, this is our executive director doing a segment for CBS when we first implemented this project. So a lot of public attention on this type of work in this area. Next. And this is what it looks like on the ground. So we installed structures basically to plug places that relic beaver dams had breached. And we're using post-assisted log structures, which is actually mimicking large wood in stream. We're going back to do adaptive management here to decrease the porosity of these structures because we want to mimic more beaver activity. But at the time, it was a conversation with the Forest Service about how comfortable they were not understanding how this work looks like on the ground or the impacts of this work. And also that I mentioned we have a really visible public. So the public is really engaged, the public really cares, and the public is out here all the time. And so they also had concerns about, does the public know and understand the actions that we're taking on the ground? Next. And this is an example of the way that we hoped and that this work did work. And so this is what I call our golden child, PAL number 9. And it's actually the main stem of this stream is in the back of the photo. And so we plugged this anticipating that there might be some flows, but it just created so much ponding following the installation. So it was great to see that response. Next.
Can I just note something real quick?
Yeah.
So, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the berm that you see behind the structure there, that's an old beaver berm. So to give you a sense of like how much beaver themselves historically changed the river and floodplain system.
So this is again to show you another way to view or see this landscape. So I don't have the pointer, but as Ryan mentioned, there's just relic beaver dams that are valley spanning across this entire area. And where we put the structures are a lot of just plugging in where those have breached. But I do want to point out again, PAL number 9 in the top right there, because this is pre-installation or it's immediately after installation, but pre-spring runoff. And so you see that there's not any sediment deposited at PAL number 9. Next. And then we flew LiDAR and created a DEM of difference between 2022 prior to installation and 2023, a year after installation, and then use that to look at the change in elevation at different points along this landscape. We can go down the rabbit hole of the, variability and error in that, but just to say, I like to point it out because of the next photo, over the next slide, that shows the areas that did have that red, which showed a higher change in elevation. What we did see in those areas, especially behind PAL 1, behind PAL 3, and behind PAL 9, this huge deposition that occurred in that area. Next. And then I like this image, actually, Dr. Emily Fairfax, who is a researcher that looks at a lot of overlap between beaver and wildfires, came out with us, and her lab took this photo when there was more vegetation on the landscape. And I like to point this out because it was 2 years after installation, and there's PAL number 9, where all those little white dots are. Those are people with hard hats on. And you can kind of see that there's green inside of that area that had all that deposition because there is vegetation going through it. So for us, it's an example of not only the role that floodplain plays in slowing water into depositing sediment, but the fact that there is vegetation growing up means it's stabilizing that sediment on the landscape. So it's cool to see. Next. And then Ryan asked me to kind of speak to partnerships in the research realm and kind of what are, I don't know how that happens, I guess, and what are the benefits, what are the difficulties with it. And I mean, the obvious benefits to us are like we don't have this capacity, don't have this knowledge base in order to assess these different questions about the efficacy of our work. And these are questions that funders love to hear. I mean, I have shared Ryan's lab's research over and over again and had talked about it numerous times, and it's really valuable for us to be able to point to. And obviously, like we have conversations about what we can do differently and how we can approach projects differently. So it's valuable for us in a funding way, in an outreach way, and in internal conversations about the work that we do. But the difficulties are that the project timelines are really difficult. We have just innumerable amount of variability that happened from year to year. One year we had a potentially listed bat species that limited the window which you could work to 2 months, which means we had to remove projects from the docket, which meant that if you were a researcher or grad student that was relying on that project going in that year, your entire, graduate trajectory was changed, or your project had to be changed. Potentially landowners sometimes change their mind about the actions they want on their property. It's just there's a lot of variability in the implementation side of things for us, and just being in the natural world. Like, did snow happen earlier than we anticipated and our season was cut short? We're high, the spring runoff longer than we thought and higher than we thought, and we can't implement in the way we thought we could. So it makes it difficult to align research goals. Have we identified a project early enough to collect baseline data so we can have enough information prior to the implementation to compare post installation? Like, all of these things are just, it adds another layer of coordination, which is fine, but sometimes gets difficult. And then we just have different goals as researchers versus practitioners. And I think a big part of it is that funder goals are usually, do you have a project that is, they call it shovel ready? Like, they are looking to fund things that have already been designed, have already been base monitored. Like, it's kind of this double-edged sword. It's very difficult. Like, who's going to provide the money for monitoring and baseline data collection prior to the funding that is implementation? So we get a lot of implementation funding. So we had to get projects on the ground, and that does not allow us a lot of time for like hey, let's like talk about it and think about how we approach this project. And so, we try to fit that in as best we can, because that is a part of our mission and how we want to do our work. But we also have to respond to funder needs and requirements. So,
Cool. Awesome. I can jump into mine, but we can also, if people have questions for Taryn, we could do that, whatever people prefer. Okay, well, I will just jump in and I will try to make this quick so that we have time for questions. But let's see here. Can everyone see this? Great. Okay. So, speaking of Upper Elkhorn, that was one of the first sites that we tackled in terms of our collaboration to try to understand maybe how well the design performed to meet both like the funding goals that CPRW had in terms of capturing sediment, as well as, the challenge for on the research side is always just like, how can I collect the data and develop an actual research project that extends that extends the scientific knowledge of these projects beyond just classic monitoring. And so this is what Brady did. So this is actually a picture that was published in the Coloradoan, I think. Brady is the handsome man with the green shirt in the stream there. Nick, who's on the holding the tape measure, he's another one of my students who's not funded by the TN but helped out. And then the guy with the fun hat, that's actually Brady's dad. So he was just happened to like show up and help with some field work. So what we really wanted to understand with Brady's work was first, I guess, just how much sediment is captured in this system in Upper Elkhorn after the installation of this low-tech process-based restoration structures. But really, the other interesting question that we wanted to understand was how much does this restoration push water out onto the floodplain that can then infiltrate and raise the groundwater table for short periods of time? So we're interested in what's known as transient groundwater storage, which can be really important because it augments like low base flows during the summer. So we kind of wanted to understand that using base data as well as some modeling techniques. So that's basically what it says here, right? So looking at sediment, looking at groundwater storage, and then kind of thinking about, okay, if we did different restoration, how might the groundwater storage change? So how effective is the existing restoration that was put in? And can we look at other scenarios that might indicate you could get more or less groundwater storage so that that can help inform future restoration efforts? So here's just another picture of Upper Elkhorn. You can see, so this is looking downstream. So you can see like the truck there for scale. And I just want to point out with these red arrows, these are all these existing beaver berms that extend laterally across the meadow. And so just to give you a little bit of a history of like why we would even want to restore a site like this and kind of the natural history of it. It looks beautiful, right? It looks like something that probably wouldn't need restoration and that most people would probably just show up and say, like, this looks like an amazing, beautiful, functioning headwater stream. But if we like back up 50, 100 years, right, this system, like a many headwater streams in Colorado and across the US, had a lot of active beaver activity, active beaver colonies. And one of the things that beavers love to do, right, is build these dams that often extend that laterally across the entire valley. And over long periods of time, right, these dams, they breach, they fix them, they breach again, they fix them. And over time, water is being stored behind these dams as well as sediment. So the valley itself starts to aggrade and rise in elevation. Well, through human interference in these systems and whether the beaver leave by themselves or are physically removed by humans, they're no longer around to fix these dams when they breach. And as soon as you have all these dams breaching, what you essentially have is the stream power increases in these systems and the stream itself starts to erode over time. So you get what's known as a base level drop, and that base level drop causes the stream to incise, right? And so the actual incision, the driver of incision in these systems is the removal of beaver, right? And so the idea is to kind of mimic putting maybe beaver dams back in the system to aggregate the system back to maybe a higher base level over time. So that's kind of like the long-term reasoning why these streams need restoration. And then when you have the wildfire, you can see just the scale of the wildfire around here. You get increased sediment loads and stream power over short periods of time, and that can further cause incision, but also provides an opportunity to capture the sediment and kickstart that rebuilding process in the stream. This is just some examples of some of these LT-PBR structures taken out in the field that Brady took while he was out there kind of taking field measurements to understand the characteristics of these structures while they were actually building them and putting them in place. I don't know, maybe you ran into Brady out there and didn't even know. that you would be kind of involved with this long term. So here's our study site. We split up the upper Elkhorn site into the study reach, which is where a lot of the PALs were installed, and then there's a reference reach downstream that isn't the best reference reach, but it works for our purposes. Um, and here you can see where the red is. Those are where the PALs were installed, post-assisted log structures, and then all the yellow dots were where we manually installed groundwater wells to monitor changes in groundwater level over time. Probably good for this slide. So Brady and the rest of my research team was out in the field a lot collecting data, including, I think like right here is maybe doing some sediment probing. I can't remember, maybe installing a gauge. And so we were looking at how much sediment was stored behind these different structures and then trying to quantify the total amount of sediment that was stored over the first season after installation. And then also looking at just things like how did the size of sediment change over time, right? Did the sediment get coarser over time? Did it get finer over time? And by how much? So once again, just a map showing the wells. We had 12 groundwater wells that we installed in our study reach, 8 downstream, and then we had a bunch of kind of expensive loggers installed in each of these wells to just measure stage in like 15-minute increments over time. Right. We also collected discharge kind of at the upstream end of the reach. Here's another picture just showing kind of the after effects in 2023 after the restoration, just some of the, how much water was spread across the floodplain, which is great, right? This is really what we want to see. And this stream discharge data was used to inform some of our numerical models that I'll show you coming up. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but basically we developed 2 different types of models and then we linked them together. So first we developed a 2D hydraulic model to help us just understand as we add more and more structures in the stream, how much does the water spread out across the floodplain and where does that happen? And that's really important because the surface water connectivity isn't, between the channel and the floodplain is not separate from the vertical subsurface water connectivity between surface water and groundwater. So we really need to know how much water gets pushed up onto the floodplain so that we can figure out how much infiltrates and then might be responsible for raising groundwater levels. So then we used a groundwater model known as ModFlow, and I won't get into all the details, but you can just see here showing the different scenarios of how we kind of captured where water was on the floodplain. So this is just showing the surface water, not the groundwater, across different scenarios. And you can see that the extent of inundation changes just in this little GIF, depending on the scenario that we looked at. And at different points along a hydrograph. Okay, so we had a ModFlow, we had a groundwater model, we had a surface water model. Took forever for Brady to get this thing calibrated, and he finally did it without complaining once, which was amazing. And then the next step was just to look at, okay, we know what was installed in terms of the restoration project. If we look at different restoration scenarios, how did the results change? And so we looked at 5 different scenarios. Scenario 3, shown in the middle of the left table here, is kind of what was installed, what's actually out there. So we have a couple scenarios with fewer or no structures at all installed. And then we have scenario 4 with almost double the number of PALs installed, and scenario 5 where we just like pack in these PALs every 5 meters. And then we kind of used like this very choppy hydrograph based on flow data that we collected over the first runoff season, just to kind of illustrate different stages of the hydrograph relative to base flow and bank flow. So just to give you some context, here's kind of what was installed out there, scenario 3. So we had a couple of scenarios with no PALs or fewer PALs than this. And then like here's our most dense installation scenario 5, where every 5 meters there was a PAL involved. So we just really wanted to know, depending on these different restoration scenarios, what are the changes in groundwater storage? Okay. First, just looking at sediment size, this is purely based on field data, and this isn't really a surprise. Other people have shown this, but it's just really good to quantify it. That the amount of or the size of sediment changed in the stream from at least just after the first year, right? From kind of a medium gravel size, 15 millimeter size sediment to a very fine gravel, barely a gravel, almost verging on sand, 3.7 millimeters, right? And this is the 50th percentile of sediment sizes. And so this is expected after a fire, right? The fines are going to be transported much more easily than the coarse material. But we did see a large fining of the stream bed, at least after the first year. We also saw a lot of sediment stored. So these box plots just show reaches behind the different pals. So we had 7 pals on the main stem. So we didn't capture the amount of sediment stored on the side channel because that wasn't originally something we were looking at. So we didn't really have baseline data. But you can see that a total of 63 cubic meters of sediment was stored in the stream. So discounting that little side channel that Taryn loved so much. And that's the equivalent of about like 1.5 large moving trucks full of sediment just stored in the stream, right? And in general, you can see like as we move downstream, this is in the direction of these bars right here, you get a decrease in sediment storage. So, the upstream pals capture most of it, and then that what makes it past the upstream pals gets captured further downstream and so forth. Except for this anomaly just upstream of pal 7. And that is really caused by local erosion, right? So one of the important takeaways from this is there's going to be fines, there's going to be sediment coming in from upstream in the watershed that you might want to capture. But you also, and I mean, I think this is a good thing, right? But you might induce local erosion that also might be stored in your, like behind your structure. So, just like the beaver berms break over time, or the channel would avulse around a beaver berm, you might have the same thing happening here, which requires adaptive management, or you just might force flow into different areas along the banks that cause local erosion. So a lot of sediment stored just in the channel, right? Not even counting the floodplain that Taryn kind of showed you earlier. All right, I'll try to make this quick because I want us to have time for questions, but we also looked at just the raw data for groundwater storage, right? So this hydrograph of groundwater levels is showing in the reference, or sorry, in the study reach here, just raw data, what we saw in terms of groundwater level during base flow conditions. So we have on the kind of 2 dashed lines, left of the dashed line is base flow, kind of basically right around the time of installation, where we wouldn't expect a lot of change immediately. Then we have a runoff period, and then we have a base flow again, right? And starting in about August, 1 year after installation. So generally what we see is an increase of about 24 centimeters of just groundwater level during base flow conditions after these structures were installed. And if we look at the same thing downstream where there were no structures installed, we basically saw no change in groundwater levels, right? So we just from visual observations, we know that groundwater levels have risen over time, which is good, right? Because it basically wets the floodplain, allows the recruitment of new vegetation and so forth. So the cool thing about this now is that we can run different scenarios and look at how storage changed across the entire reach. Each of these kind of colorful plots shows differences between basically no structures in the stream and then the different scenarios. So R2 minus R1, for instance, is like scenario 2 might, with a few structures compared to having no structures. Scenario 3, for instance, with existing structures with no structures and so forth. All you need to know is most of the storage happens during low flows. And as we move through the hydrograph, you get less change in storage compared to no structures at all. And that is simply because during high flows, you just get water going everywhere, whether there's structures in the system or not, right? So the floodplain connects, you get infiltration, but where the structures are really beneficial are during lower flows and base flow, okay? And then we wanted to see like how much of a difference does having more or less pals make in terms of groundwater storage. I won't go through all of these plots in detail. I will say that any pals at all increases groundwater storage, which is great. As we add more and more pals to the stream, you get kind of basically incremental changes in the amount of groundwater storage. So if we look at just the how much additional groundwater storage you get when installing a few pals, let's say 5 pals in the system, you can get quite a lot, like maybe 4,000 cubic meters of extra water. As you go to like the next addition of pals, you only get like a 2% increase in groundwater storage. If you add even more pals, maybe only 2.5% and so forth. So the difference between basically what was installed and if we pack the whole stream full of structures, you'd get maybe like an 8% change in water storage for probably 10 times as much money or something like that. So there's this trade-off, right? It's not just add more structures, get more groundwater storage. It's kind of a non-linear response, which is just good to know that there might be kind of the sweet spot where you get your maximum benefit for the least amount of effort spent on the stream. So takeaways here, we know that sediment fined, we know that there was a lot of sediment stored in the system, which is great just to know this, to communicate to future funders and help CPRW get more money. And we saw a decent amount of rise in groundwater table, which just helps these systems be more resilient, stay green, be more resilient to future disturbances, and so forth. And so all this work, this is all the great work that Brady did. We have future work. I just want to mention one thing because it's so stinking cool. The next project we're working on, or like the hot new project that we're just starting with Elise, who's on this call, is we're looking at these systems, upper Elkhorn included, and we're trying to understand, okay, as we get different like pools and riffles and geomorphic features forming in these streams because of the restoration. We know that these different features will have different changes in temperature that are really important for the trout living in these streams, right? But we don't know how important it is for the fish and how important the restoration is on improving trout habitat. So we're going to be basically sprinkling temperature sensors all throughout these reaches to measure ambient stream temperature. Then we're going to capture a whole bunch of fish. We're going to install stream temperatures in the fish themselves and let them swim around for a season and then recapture them and measure the temperature where they liked to hang out and then compare basically where are they hanging out during different times of the day and different times of the year. Where are those temperature values most prevalent in the stream, and how does that change throughout the entire catchment to get an idea of how effective these are in terms of trout habitat? So lots of unanswered questions still, right? This stuff was mostly focused that I talked about on like hydrology and sediment, but the whole ecological side of stuff is completely wide open, and so we're really excited to work on that. So I think we have like 10 minutes or so. Happy to answer any questions. See if I can stop sharing my screen. Okay. Any questions?
I really like the work, and I was kind of wondering if like biomimicry was like a part of this, or like because I know you're trying to sort of like represent the beaver concept.
Do you want to answer that, Taryn, or do you want me to answer?
Yeah, it's funny. I just heard this phrase recently, biomimicry. I mean, that is what process-based restoration is. So whenever I talk about the history of how we've approached stream restoration, it went from, form-based. We as humans know how this should look based on different metrics of the stream and transition that into, well, what aspects of the stream were healthy and how do we create them? And so, yeah, we're mimicking, like I said, PALs are mimicking large wood that would naturally occur in streams, and log jams and BDAs or beaver dam analogs are mimicking actions that beaver would take. So yeah, I've not explored the definition of that term, but I would assume it is this one and the same, just different name.
Yeah. And one thing that we're learning is that, if we kind of follow this line of what did you call it? Biomimicry. If there were beaver out there, they would be actively managing these structures, right? Like they would be moving the structures around when the river moves as well, and they would be plugging holes and so forth. And so, if we really want to biomimic the processes that are occurring on the stream, we need to think longer term. And that's, I think, maybe been one of the hardest things for CPR, for Taryn to like maybe convince funders of is like, it's not good enough to just get 2 years of funding and put these in. We really need to maintain like basically a stewardship of the restoration project to think about it took a long time for the system to degrade. It's going to take a long time for it to come back, right? And so I think funders need to be willing to fund that sort of work.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that long-term thinking. Well,
Hmm.
great job, guys.
Thanks.
Ryan, there's a question in the chat about relocating beaver.
Mm.
And I did want to touch on that. It is a question I get almost every time I talk about this work. And I like to point out that we are doing this work really in response to post-fire, and in the environments that we exist in means that there's degradation on this landscape. So we have not, and as an entity, identified relocating beaver as a viable option because I think I and most people that look into this would want to make sure that the place that beaver arrive would be a place that they can survive in the long term. We have a lot of conversations about you can't just drop beaver in a landscape and expect it to thrive in the way that we want it to unless you have deep pools, unless you have food source, unless you have kind of all of the necessary parts of their habitat to help them thrive. But I talk about Elkhorn watershed as an entirety because a big part of what we're trying to do is the most downstream project that we're involved in actually has active beaver. So my vision is if we can improve habitat to the point where beaver can move from downstream to upstream, that might be like Rachel's putting into the chat, might be a natural way for us to get beaver up there. But I could foresee projects in the future that are geared more toward translocation because I think that's a really important part of this for the long-term vision of how we want these landscapes to be.
Yeah, and if you recall just what the aerial images look like of Upper Elkhorn, right? There's very little riparian vegetation, right? And so they just would not have their food source, right? So they basically use the vegetation for their food and their den building and um, to basically back up water. And basically they build these dams because they're good for they use it to hide under. It's like cover, right? It's protection. And so if they don't have the food source, then they just won't survive.
Oh, right. And I thought of the other question that came in.
Yeah.
I'm curious what the source of the sediment is. Is it like from the soil layer or is the bedrock being eroded? Because yeah, I
Yeah,
work in a watersheds that where the bedrock is like this really erodible sandstone. So I'm curious like
oh,
about
interesting.
that, how it might be like different there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all like basically topsoil in this area, right? It's just, classic problem with wildfires is it becomes super hydrophobic and the vegetation is gone, so all of that soil just a lot more is able to move, especially in the first year or two after the fire. So yeah. Um, but there is a lot of movement, I would say. Like, let's say these structures hadn't been installed, there probably would have been a lot of local erosion from the bed itself that would be moving downstream too. Yeah. Any other questions?
Looks like there was just one in the chat. Are there ways to know/model the aerial extension longevity of raised water tables?
Mm. Yeah, and that's kind of what Brady's work was able to do a little bit. I kind of glossed over it real quick, but we could have just kind of made some observations using the groundwater wells themselves, but we really wanted to look at volume, right? And so we did. So the mod flow model gives you at least within the model domain, right? How much water is stored spatially, right? Um, and for how long is it? I mean, it hopefully as long as these structures are maintained, right? As soon as you kind of reduce the capacity of the system to connect with its floodplain, and keep that groundwater raised, then as long as you can keep that process going, you should maintain the high groundwater levels. But if the system goes back to a mostly incised state, then I would presume you would lose that amount of storage in the groundwater. Hotspot areas to generate erosion. Um, if the question is related to like local erosion in the stream itself, or is it more like hill slope erosion? I think both. I mostly hill slope. Like I think that's a lot of what maybe CPRW did with its planning, hill slope erosion. Okay, I think. Do you want to talk about that, Taryn?
Yeah, that was a part of one of the metrics that went into the Upper Poudre Resiliency Plan was sediment source and where it would come from. So different hill slope erodibility. And we actually just completed a hydraulic model across the entire watershed to model different scenarios in different burn scenarios. So it is something that goes into the different modeling efforts that we have for our plans. And because we have 2 minutes and there's no more questions, I did, because this is a partnership meeting theme, I think I didn't touch on, I want to, for the sake of this group, that there is huge value in the connection between our organization as practitioners and CSU and in the actual quantitative, like research and outcomes in that way. But it's really valuable too. I often joke that Ryan is my kind of connection to CSU and to different researchers and what's happening there. And, it overlaps and, hey, we need a room for this event, or, hey, I'm doing this talk. Do you have people that should come? And it's really valuable to have that direct connection, not just in this, like what tangible results and papers come out of it, but what allows us to do our work more efficiency and more efficiently and connect to the right people and have a broader reach in an area that just isn't, the academic side isn't my world, but it's Ryan's world. And so I can connect to him to have that broader reach. So I just want to say thanks for that and point that out for this series.
I love working with CPRW. And speaking of which, so CPRW, can I plug the Beaver Talks?
Yeah, leave it to
C
beavers. Yeah.
Is that what it's called? Leave it to Beavers?
Yeah, we joke that you have to say leave it to beavers because there's copyright infringement with leave it to beavers. So
Oh, I gotcha. Well, so CPRW is hosting this series of talks focused on the importance of beavers. And in June, we're expecting a pretty big turnout. And so, because Emily Fairfax, if you guys are in the beaver world, you've heard of Emily Fairfax. She's at University of Minnesota now. She's going to be coming to Fort Collins to talk about her work. And because we're expecting a large crowd size, I think we're going to try to co-host it at CSU and have probably about 200 people or so here. And then I don't know, maybe are you guys streaming it online? I mean, we could definitely do something like that if we wanted a larger audience. But this is what like these connections are able to facilitate is like these really cool, just I mean, learning opportunities and I don't know, opportunities to nerd out, which is all I really care about. So yeah. So if you're in Fort Collins and want to see Emily Fairfax, she'll be here in June. And it's co-hosted by the TN. Oh, and CPRW is also looking for a seasonal technician this summer.
Well, I will share that job posting in our
Great.
job board on Slack. So cool.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan,
Yeah.
Taryn. It was awesome to hear about your work. Thanks everyone for joining us today too. And our next speaker series will be on Wednesday, March 25th at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. So hope to see you all there and hope everyone has a great weekend.
All right. Thanks,
thanks all.
everyone. Thanks, Taryn.
Yeah.